July 1943. A train screeches to a halt under the blistering Texas sun. Inside, hundreds of German prisoners brace themselves for the worst: starvation, humiliation, perhaps death. The air is thick with sweat, dust, and fear. But when the doors slam open, they freeze. Because what greets them isn't a firing squad or concrete prison walls, it's a man, a cowboy. Hat tipped low, spurs glinting in the sun, leaning against a fence post like he's stepped straight out of a movie reel. The Germans blink, disbelieving. Is this captivity, or some kind of trick? As the days unfold, they'll discover something stranger than any battlefield victory or defeat. A prison where freedom hums in the air, where kindness feels more dangerous than cruelty, and where a simple handshake from a cowboy can shake a man's beliefs to the core. This is the story of how America's cowboys taught their enemies a lesson no gun ever could. If you love powerful, true stories that reveal the hidden side of history, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. And if something in this tale surprises you or makes you think, drop a comment below. We read every single one. The train thundered across the scorched plains of Texas, its wheels shrieking like metal beasts on fire. Inside the boxcars, German prisoners pressed against the wooden slats, their uniforms sticky with sweat and fear. They'd been told they were being sent to humiliation, perhaps starvation, maybe death. The Allies had won in North Africa, and defeat was still a raw wound that burned through pride and memory alike. Dust leaked through the cracks in the doors, coating their throats, clinging to the last traces of arrogance they carried. Someone muttered that America would treat them like cattle. Another whispered, "We will never see home again." Then the train screeched to a halt. The doors swung open with a violent clang, and sunlight crashed inside like a wave. The men squinted, shielding their eyes against a horizon that stretched farther than imagination. What they saw made them fall silent. Not the grey walls of a prison, not rows of watchtowers or barbed wire stretching to infinity, but open land, shimmering heat, and a man leaning on a fence post. He looked as if he'd stepped out of a dream, broad hat, sun-browned face, a glint of spurs catching the light. One prisoner whispered a word with disbelief and awe tangled together: cowboy. For a moment, everything they'd been told about America cracked. This was no industrial monster, new steel on pier. This was something else, raw, untamed, impossibly alive. Even in defeat, they couldn't look away. The cowboy didn't shout, didn't sneer. He just watched them calm and unbothered, chewing a piece of straw between his teeth. Behind him, horses flicked their tails lazily, indifferent to the scene unfolding. The guards who stood nearby wore the same hats, the same boots. They looked less like soldiers and more like ranch hands who'd wandered into a war by accident. Their silence carried a strange authority. When the order finally came, Ausgehen, the prisoners stumbled out. Their boots sank into soft Texas soil, so different from the cobblestones of Bremen or Berlin. The air smelled of dust, cattle, and sunlight. They expected jeers, rifles, commands barked like insults. Instead, they found patience, quiet, almost curious eyes studying them not as monsters, but as men who had lost. It unsettled them more than hatred ever could. Children watched from the fence line, perched on rails like birds, whispering to their mothers. Women in sunbonnets shaded their faces, murmuring at the sight of young men no older than their own sons overseas. The camp they were led to looked nothing like the prisons they'd imagined. No concrete fortresses, no snarling guards. Just wooden barracks, open fields, and fences that seemed too fragile to hold an army. A smell drifted from the mess hall beef stew, thick and rich. Coffee, real coffee. Some prisoners turned away, their throats tight. Their families back home hadn't smelled such food in years. One young soldier, barely 20, clenched his fists as his stomach growled. "It's a trick," he muttered. But another whispered back, voice trembling, "If it's a trick, it smells better than any truth I know." They lined up, their shadows long against the dust. The cowboy still stood by the fence, one hand resting on the rail. He didn't look triumphant, just steady, as if nothing here surprised him at all. That calmness stung more than arrogance. It was the calm of a man who had never feared another, who didn't need to prove anything. To the defeated soldiers, that kind of confidence was both foreign and magnetic. As they marched past him, the cowboy tipped his hat, just a simple nod, a flick of courtesy. And somehow that small gesture cut deeper than any insult. It said, "You're beaten, but you're still men." Inside the barracks that night, the Germans lay awake. The air was thick with the scent of sage and hay. Outside, a harmonica drifted through the dark, lonely and soft. No one spoke for a long time. When one finally did, his voice was low, uncertain. "If this is captivity," he said, "then I don't understand freedom anymore." His words hung there, fragile as dust, carried out through the cracks into the prairie night. The first morning began with a whistle, sharp, echoing across the still Texas dawn. The German prisoners jolted awake, bracing for harsh orders, for punishment, for the cruelty they'd been promised on the journey here. But when they filed into the mess hall, the smell hit them first, thick, rich, almost mocking. Beef stew simmered in massive pots. Cornbread steamed on tin trays, and coffee, real, dark, bitter coffee, filled the air. The men hesitated, staring as if they'd stumbled into an illusion. A guard with a tilted hat nodded toward the tables. "Eat," he said simply, his voice calm, almost casual. No shouting, no sneer. Just ... eat. One prisoner lifted his spoon cautiously, sipped, and froze. The meat melted on his tongue. Another tore into the cornbread, soft and sweet. For the first time since capture, someone actually laughed. "My mother hasn't tasted beef in 3 years," he whispered. They ate in silence, shame mingling with gratitude. How could the enemy feed them so well when their own people starved back home? Every mouthful felt like betrayal, yet their bodies welcomed it with desperate relief. Letters home, carefully censored but heavy with hints, soon told the truth. "Mother," one man wrote, "don't worry for me. I eat more here than I did as a boy." Others mentioned the endless coffee, the white bread. The guards found their astonishment amusing. To them, it wasn't luxury, just an ordinary meal, the same one a farmhand might eat before work. But to the Germans, it was abundance, freedom made edible. After breakfast came orders, but not the kind they expected. No drills, no cruelty, just work. They were to help on nearby farms under the Geneva Convention's labor rules. To their surprise, even labor here came with dignity. At first, they resented it. Soldiers of the Afrika Korps reduced to farmer hands, but when they stepped into the open fields, when the wind brushed against their faces and the sun burned gold across the plains, something inside them softened. Cowboys showed them how to work, not by shouting, but by doing. A Texan with a sun-cracked grin demonstrated how to lift hay bales without straining their backs. "Like this," he said, voice steady as dust. The German tried, failed, then tried again. The cowboy helped, patient and wordless. By sunset, the prisoner could do it right. That night, he admitted quietly, "I've never seen authority that teaches instead of commands." And then came the biggest shock of all. Pay, real pay. Each man received 80 cents a day in camp credit, enough for chocolate, cigarettes, or letters. For men who had served Hitler without reward, it felt unreal. A corporal joked bitterly, "I fought for the FRO and earned nothing. I pick cotton for a cowboy and get paid." Laughter followed, awkward, uncertain, but real. Even humor felt like forbidden luxury. Sundays brought small kindnesses. A rancher might offer lemonade after work. A farmer's wife might pass biscuits through the fence. For men raised on propaganda about American barbarity, every smile was a quiet rebellion against everything they'd believed. Yet not everyone could accept it. Some called this kindness a weapon, a way to make them weak. "They're trying to break us with decency," one officer warned. But deep down, many already knew the truth. The camp's rhythm settled into something strange, peaceful, even domestic. The clang of dishes, the low murmur of conversation, the sound of horses outside. Captivity had become something unthinkable, almost bearable, almost human. Still, at night, guilt crept in. They thought of their families under bombed-out roofs, of children clutching ration cards while they drank coffee and watched sunsets through barbed wire. Comfort became its own quiet torment. One evening, a young prisoner leaned against the fence, staring at the horizon. "We were told America was soulless," he murmured. "But here, even the wind feels alive." The cowboy nearby tipped his hat and said nothing. In that silence, under the vast Texas sky, the Germans began to sense something their leaders had never taught them, that freedom was not about conquest or control, but about how you carried yourself when no one was watching. Morning broke over the camp in streaks of pink and gold, the sun rising like a silent overseer. The German prisoners lined up for roll call, expecting monotony. Instead, their days began to take unexpected shape. After breakfast, trucks arrived to carry groups of men out to local farms. The guards didn't bark orders, they spoke plainly, almost like foremen assigning shifts. The work was real, but the fear had faded. Cotton fields stretched endlessly beneath the sky. The soil clung to their boots, the heat pressed on their backs. Yet, amid the exhaustion, there was something quietly liberating, the rhythm of honest labor replacing the noise of war. At first, pride made some resist. They were soldiers, not farmers. But the cowboys who worked beside them changed that idea. Their strength was calm, not cruel. Their commands came through demonstration, not domination. A German lieutenant tried to outwork a Texan one afternoon, hauling bales until his arms trembled. The cowboy only grinned, handed him a canteen, and said, "Ain't a contest, partner. Just work steady." The lieutenant never forgot that tone. As the days passed, the barrier between prisoner and guard began to blur. They shared tools, shade, and silence. The cowboys spoke slowly, their drawl carrying warmth. The Germans listened, half curious, half humbled. Every evening, as the trucks rattled back to camp, the men sat quieter than before. They had expected humiliation in labor. Instead, they found a strange dignity in being useful again. Inside the camp, the canteen shelves drew constant fascination. For the first time, they could buy things, razor blades, stationery, even chocolate. Some hoarded their credits. Others spent freely, savoring small pleasures that felt almost sinful. One corporal bought a harmonica. Each night he sat outside the barracks and played. At first it was German folk songs. Soon the tunes shifted into clumsy versions of cowboy melodies he'd overheard in the fields. It wasn't long before laughter replaced suspicion. The guards didn't stop them. They even joined in sometimes, tapping their boots in rhythm. In a place built on division, music became the one shared language neither side mistrusted. But not everyone welcomed the change. A handful of die-hard loyalists scowled at the easy camaraderie. They called their fellow soldiers weak, traitors softened by American comfort. "They're making us forget who we are," one hissed through clenched teeth. Arguments flared in the barracks after lights out. Some spoke of honor and obedience, others of humanity and survival. One young prisoner snapped, "If respect is treason, then maybe I've had enough loyalty." The room fell silent afterwards. Outside, the cowboys carried on as usual, steady, unbothered. They didn't argue politics or ideology. They mended fences, fixed saddles, and trusted the horizon more than any speech. That simple steadiness became its own quiet sermon. One afternoon, a Texan helped a German repair a broken fence post. When it was done, the cowboy extended his hand. The prisoner hesitated, then shook it. The rough grip felt like a peace treaty without words. He wrote about it that night, calling it the handshake that undid my anger. For years, he'd been taught that respect was weakness. Here, he learned it could be strength in disguise. The work continued, and with it came small revelations. The Germans learned to read the land, when to rest the horses, how to spot rain on the wind. They began to appreciate the simplicity of skill over status. By autumn, even the most defiant among them had to admit a truth that burned quietly. The Americans didn't need to shout to command. Their authority came from something older, something freer, born from the open land itself. One evening, as dusk spilled over the plains, a prisoner looked toward a cowboy riding home, silhouetted against the sunset. "He works harder than any of us," he murmured, "and yet he's freer than all of us." That thought lingered long after the lights dimmed. For the first time, the men began to realize that kindness could be more subversive than cruelty, and that freedom, once seen, could never be forgotten again. By midsummer, the camp no longer felt like a cage, at least not entirely. Barbed wire still marked the boundaries, but inside those fences, something unexpected had begun to grow: curiosity and even learning. The Americans, practical to the core, realized that idle prisoners meant restless minds, so they offered classes, English lessons, woodworking, even basic agriculture. The Germans, once soldiers of empire, now became students under the Texas sun.
In long, dusty halls, guards turned teachers. Chalk scraped against blackboards as German men repeated hesitant English phrases. "Good morning." "Thank you." "Coffee." They stumbled through pronunciation, laughter echoing where bitterness once lived. For some, it was humiliating. For others, liberating. They had been told to conquer the world. Now they were learning how to greet it properly. One man joked, "Perhaps freedom begins with learning to say hello." Books began circulating through the camp, tattered volumes donated by locals, school textbooks, even dime store westerns. The prisoners devoured them, not just for knowledge, but for escape. In those pages, America became more than their enemy. A few who'd been teachers before the war started their own lectures: history, mathematics, philosophy. The guards didn't stop them. "Better they think than fight," one cowboy muttered, leaning against a doorway as he listened quietly. At night, barracks flickered with lantern light. Men bent over notebooks, whispering words to themselves. For the first time in years, learning wasn't propaganda. It was discovery. They were rebuilding their minds from the ruins of obedience. Music, too, found its way in. Harmonicas, violins, even handmade guitars appeared. The Germans began with their own folk songs, mournful and nostalgic, but soon mixed in the melodies they'd heard from their Texan guards. By late evening, the camp sounded like an uneasy harmony between two worlds, old Europe and the American frontier. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close enough to taste. Even guards were drawn by the sound. They'd lean against fences, arms crossed, smiling as the music drifted through the dark. Sometimes one would hum along, off-key but sincere. The barbed wire seemed thinner on those nights. Newspapers emerged next, printed by hand on mimeograph machines. The Germans filled them with essays, poetry, and camp gossip. One issue even included a debate titled, Is freedom possible within a fence? No one dared answer directly, but their words said enough. They were thinking again, questioning quietly what strength and freedom really meant. Even in captivity, they had found a place where ideas could move faster than guards ever could. One afternoon, a cowboy stopped near a work crew and handed a prisoner a book. It was an old Western, the cover faded and torn. "You might like this one," he said, then walked away. The German read it that night. The story was simple: a rancher, a storm, a test of character. But something in it stirred him. He saw in the cowboy's stubborn dignity a kind of strength his army had never taught. The next day, he passed the book to another prisoner. Soon it was traveling from bunk to bunk, its pages soft with fingerprints. "It's just a story," someone said, but everyone knew it was more than that. Even work began to feel different. Where once there had been resentment, now there was rhythm. The men moved with quiet purpose, guided by habit and the strange satisfaction of competence. Labor had become a form of learning. Sometimes, after a long day in the fields, the cowboys would demonstrate how to rope a calf or shoe a horse. The Germans would watch, fascinated. "You see," one cowboy said, "you can't force the rope, you guide it." That simple lesson sank deeper than he knew. To men raised on command and obedience, the idea of guiding instead of controlling felt revolutionary. The cowboy's world was full of freedom disguised as ordinary life. And as night fell across the prairie, harmonicas wailed softly once more. The Germans lay on their bunks, eyes open, listening, not to orders, not to speeches, but to the music of a world that refused to hate them. The prisoners began to notice something about the men who guarded them. These cowboys, sunburned, dusty, quiet, carried themselves with a confidence that didn't need rank or medals to command respect. It was instinctive, effortless. Unlike officers in the German army, the cowboys didn't bark orders or demand obedience. They spoke sparingly, moved deliberately, and seemed anchored in a calm the prisoners couldn't comprehend. Authority here wasn't shouted, it was lived. They called it the cowboy way, though few could explain it. It wasn't written anywhere, yet it guided every gesture, how they treated their horses, their tools, even their prisoners. Honor wasn't claimed, it was demonstrated daily. A German sergeant once tested that quiet authority. He mocked a guard trying to provoke anger. The cowboy only looked at him, calm as stone, and said, "Son, you can't insult a man who's free inside." The word struck harder than a blow. That night, the sergeant lay awake, turning the sentence over in his head. Free inside. What did that mean to a man whose freedom was wrapped in barbed wire and loss? Every encounter added layers to the mystery. The cowboys worked hard, rose before dawn, and faced every task with a kind of unhurried determination. To the prisoners, it felt like strength stripped of ego, power without cruelty. When a storm rolled across the plains one afternoon, lightning cracked open the sky. The guards moved fast, securing horses, shouting to one another over the wind. The Germans watched from the barracks as chaos met grace. One guard's hat blew off. Another slipped in the mud, laughing even as rain drenched him. The sight startled the prisoners. They had never seen discipline coexist with such casual joy. Later, when the storm passed, the same men shared coffee under a tin awning, water dripping from their hats. "We ride it out," one cowboy said, smiling. "Always ride it out." A lesson disguised as small talk. The Germans began keeping notes, not just of labor or meals, but of mannerisms. How cowboys greeted each other with nods instead of salutes. How respect was earned through deeds, not demands. How no man acted superior. One prisoner, once fiercely loyal to the Reich, found himself studying their behavior like scripture. He noticed that strength here was measured in endurance, not dominance, a lesson that quietly dismantled his belief in power through fear. Sometimes the cowboys joked with them. A guard might call out, Y'all working or just sightseeing? The tone carried no malice. The laughter that followed was real, cautious at first, then easy, almost friendly. That humor, gentle and unforced, disarmed them more than any weapon could. It made them human again, reminded them they were men before they were enemies. Even the hardest hearts couldn't resist the slow erosion of kindness. In the evenings, when the light softened over the prairie, cowboys would gather near the fences. They'd talk about cattle prices, weather, and family. Simple conversations that spoke of a life steady and unbroken by ideology. The Germans listened quietly, absorbing those fragments of freedom. No propaganda, no shouting, just men grounded by land and labor. They realized that the cowboys' code wasn't about rules, it was about balance between strength and humility. A diary found decades later carried a haunting line. I feared American guns. I did not expect to fear their decency. That confession captured the quiet power the cowboys held, one born not of violence, but virtue. As weeks passed, imitation replaced curiosity. Prisoners straightened their backs like the cowboys did, learned to speak less, to work more steadily. They didn't realize it then, but they were beginning to mirror the freedom they envied. One night, a German officer admitted softly, "These men have conquered the world differently, not with tanks or orders, but with the way they live." No one argued. Even pride bowed before that truth. By autumn, the barbed wire still stood, but something invisible had changed. The prisoners had stopped seeing the cowboys as captors. They saw them as living proof that true strength didn't come from control. It came from calm. As summer deepened, a quiet divide began to split the barracks. It wasn't hunger or punishment that caused it, but something far subtler. A shift in belief, a soft rebellion of the mind. Some prisoners still clung fiercely to the ideology that had shaped them. They spoke of loyalty, honor, and the fatherland with the same rigid devotion they'd carried into battle. But their words sounded hollow now, even to themselves. Others, however, had begun to change. They found themselves laughing at American jokes, humming cowboy songs, even mimicking the slow, easy drawl of their guards. It frightened them. How naturally the transformation had come. One evening, a young private admitted, almost in shame, "I think I like them." His bunkmate glared. "You like the enemy?" he hissed. But the younger man only shrugged. "They don't treat us like enemies anymore." The hardliners grew louder in response, their pride cornered by kindness. They whispered warnings, reminding everyone that weakness was treason. But every bowl of stew, every handshake, every gentle word from a cowboy chipped away at certainty. Fights broke out in hushed corners. Men argued not over food or labor, but over meaning, what loyalty owed, what freedom offered. One night, a sergeant shouted, "The Reich made us soldiers! America is making us men!" Silence followed, heavy and electric. Even those who disagreed felt something stir inside. It was the kind of truth that could not be unsaid, no matter how tightly one clung to the past. American officers noticed the tension. Reports described psychological unrest, a polite phrase for ideological collapse. They began separating the diehards, sending them to stricter camps, leaving behind those who simply wanted to work and breathe. In the main camp, the atmosphere lightened. The shouting stopped. Conversations grew easier. The prisoners who remained no longer walked like soldiers. They moved like men rediscovering their own humanity, cautious but alive. One afternoon, a cowboy overheard a prisoner arguing about Hitler. The German's voice broke as he said, "He promised strength but gave us ashes." The cowboy didn't interrupt. He just nodded, understanding more than words could say. Inside the barracks, small acts of rebellion turned inward. Some men ripped the insignia from their uniforms. Others began sketching landscapes instead of symbols. A few simply sat outside, watching the sunset, saying nothing at all. Letters home grew less patriotic, more personal. They wrote not of glory but of longing, for peace, for family, for quiet. One man confessed, "I came here defeated, but now I am learning what victory feels like." The guards noticed the change too. They spoke of the Germans less as prisoners and more as workers, even neighbors. "They're good hands," one cowboy said. "Just need time to forget who told them they weren't." Still, guilt lingered like a shadow. The men knew their families starved while they drank endless coffee. Every kindness they received felt both gift and wound. Gratitude had begun to sting like shame. On Sunday afternoons, some prisoners gathered near the fence to talk about home. "When we return," one asked quietly, "what do we tell them? That the enemy fed us better than our own?" No one had an answer. One night, a fight broke out between a loyalist and a man who'd befriended an American guard. It ended with both sitting in silence, staring at their bruised hands. The loyalist whispered, "Maybe we've both been lied to." After that, open defiance faded. The camp settled into uneasy peace, not born from surrender, but from realization. The barbed wire still stood, yet inside it, old loyalties had begun to crumble like dry earth. By winter's edge, even the staunchest believers spoke more softly. They still called themselves soldiers, but their hearts no longer beat to the drum of conquest. Something quieter had replaced it: respect, confusion, and a longing for truth. And through it all, the Cowboys remained the same: steady, wordless, unbroken. They didn't preach or boast. They simply lived as they always had, showing the prisoners day by day what freedom looked like when it didn't need to prove itself. Autumn arrived with cool winds sweeping across the plains, carrying the scent of hay and rain. The camp, once tense and uncertain, had softened into something almost ordinary. A strange rhythm of coexistence neither side had expected. Everyday gestures began to mean more than orders or rations. A guard offering an extra biscuit, a prisoner mending a torn saddle without being asked. Small exchanges that said, wordlessly, "We see each other now." One afternoon, a baseball rolled through the fence. The prisoners hesitated before tossing it back, but the cowboy on the other side grinned. "Y'all play?" he asked. Within minutes, a game began, laughter replacing suspicion. The barbed wire became a boundary for rules, not hearts. Guards cheered as prisoners swung and missed. Prisoners clapped when a cowboy struck out. For a moment, the war felt impossibly far away. When evening came, the game ended in applause instead of orders. A cowboy tipped his hat toward the Germans and said, "Good game, boys." No propaganda could have prepared them for kindness that casual. Inside the barracks, talk of the match filled the air. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "They treat us as men, not enemies. It confuses me, and somehow it comforts me." That night, music followed. A harmonica sighed through the dark, joined by a guitar strummed somewhere beyond the fence. The two melodies met in the wind, tangled like languages that no longer needed translation. The next morning, work continued as always, but the air felt different. The men joked more, smiled easier. Even the guards noticed. "Guess they're starting to breathe again," one cowboy said, adjusting his hat against the sun. A few days later, a local rancher invited several prisoners to help brand cattle. They worked side by side, sweat streaking their faces, smoke curling into the open sky. It was labor, yes, but it felt shared. When the work ended, the rancher poured lemonade into chipped glasses and handed them around, prisoners and cowboys alike. "Hot one today?" he muttered. No speeches, no tension. Just men cooling off together in the same dust. One German hesitated before drinking. "Why are you kind to us?" he asked. The cowboy shrugged. "Ain't about kind. It's about right." The simplicity of the answer struck harder than any sermon could. As the sun dropped low, they sat quietly, listening to the insects hum across the fields. It was the kind of silence born not from fear, but from understanding. Fragile, uncertain, but real. In the camp, some began crafting gifts for the locals. Carved horses, small wooden boxes, sketches of the Texas plains. It wasn't required. It was gratitude, shaped by hands that once held rifles. The guards accepted them with quiet nods. One cowboy found a tiny wooden horse left on his bunk. On the underside, scratched faintly in German, were the words, "For your patience." He kept it all his life. Even illness softened the barriers. When one prisoner collapsed from heat exhaustion, a cowboy carried him to shade, fanning his face until he stirred. "Easy now," the guard said softly. "Ain't no shame in falling." Moments like that spread through the camp like ripples. Compassion became contagious, each act defying the logic of war. The Germans began to see freedom not as privilege, but as a practice, something lived, not granted. At night, stories replaced silence. The cowboys spoke of droughts, wild horses, and rodeos. The Germans told of the Rhine, snow, and lost cities. For the first time, they weren't comparing nations, only memories. And as winter neared, the camp glowed faintly under lantern light. The music, the laughter, the shared labor. It all became a quiet rebellion against hate. Within that fragile truce, both sides rediscovered something profoundly simple, the humanity they'd nearly forgotten. Spring crept across the plains, soft and green. Wildflowers dotted the fields beyond the fences, and though the land breathed renewal, the air inside the camp grew heavy with rumors, whispers of Germany's collapse. The prisoners gathered in tight circles, letters trembling in their hands. Some spoke of bombed cities, others of missing families. One man read aloud a censored line that still cut deep. "Our house no longer stands." At first, no one believed it. The Reich, they'd been told, was eternal, unbreakable. Yet with each passing week, the news grew darker. Even the most loyal began to falter, their certainty eroding like sand under the wind. One morning, a truck arrived carrying newspapers. The headlines confirmed what many feared. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The camp fell into stunned silence, broken only by the rustle of pages and the sound of men exhaling disbelief. Some wept openly, others clenched their fists. A few just sat staring at the ground, as if the earth itself had betrayed them. The war that had defined their lives was gone, and with it, their purpose. The guards didn't gloat. They didn't jeer or lecture. Instead, they went about their work as usual, feeding horses, mending fences. The steady rhythm of their labor was strangely comforting to the men who'd lost everything. One cowboy passed a cup of coffee through the fence to a trembling prisoner. "You'll need this more than I do," he said quietly. No politics, no pity, just decency, as simple as sunlight. That act of calmness broke something inside the Germans. Not pride, but despair. Kindness, when they least deserved it, felt unbearable. It forced them to confront what their own leaders had never shown: mercy. Days passed in a fog of confusion. Some prisoners celebrated the end, others cursed it, but all of them felt a hollow space where certainty had once lived. The enemy had won, and somehow it didn't feel like defeat. Work continued, though more slowly now. The prisoners harvested grain, mended roofs, helped ranchers prepare for summer. The rhythm of labor steadied their minds, keeping them from drowning in thoughts of home and rubble. One evening, a German officer sat beside a cowboy at the edge of the field. "Do you hate us?" he asked. The cowboy shook his head. "No, war's over now. Ain't much point in hating." That night, the officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans have defeated us with dignity. They wield forgiveness like a weapon sharper than any blade." It was the first honest line he'd written in years. Letters arrived from Europe, filled with grief. Wives lost, children gone, cities in ruins. Some prisoners could barely read them without shaking. Others folded the pages neatly, staring at the horizon in silent disbelief. The camp chaplain offered words of comfort, but it was the cowboys' quiet steadiness that helped most. Their lives went on as if nothing had changed, feeding cattle, patching fences, existing without bitterness. For men who'd believed strength required domination, this resilience was disorienting. How could these ordinary ranchers endure loss without turning cruel? How could they remain so free in a world so broken? At night, the prisoners gathered under dim lanterns, trading memories. One said softly, "We thought we were superior. Yet here, behind wire, I've seen what real strength looks like. And it wears spurs, not medals." The next morning, the sky was washed in gold. The camp flag fluttered weakly in the breeze. Germany had fallen, but the Cowboys still stood, quiet proof that endurance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply carries on. When roll call ended, a guard said, "You'll be going home soon." The words hung in the air, half relief, half sorrow. Because though the prisoners longed for home, they also knew something unspoken. Part of them would never leave Texas behind. The day of departure arrived quietly, without ceremony or music. The German prisoners packed their few belongings, letters, carvings, notebooks, each item a fragment of a strange captivity that had changed them in ways words couldn't capture. Trains lined the tracks just as they had years before, but the men boarding them were no longer the same. They had arrived as soldiers filled with arrogance. They were leaving as men marked by humility. Cowboys stood along the fence, hands resting on posts, watching the prisoners file out. No one spoke much. A few nodded, a few waved. There was no triumph, only mutual respect in the silence. One prisoner paused at the gate, clutching a wooden horse he'd carved months earlier. He handed it to a guard and said softly, "For your patience." The cowboy nodded, tipping his hat. "Safe travels, friend." Inside the train cars, the men sat quietly, staring through the barred windows at the endless plains. The land they once feared now seemed impossibly vast, peaceful, and heartbreakingly free. As the wheels groaned into motion, the landscape began to slide away. The fences, the barns, the wide skies that had watched their transformation. A few men pressed their palms against the glass as if to hold on. Some cried silently, others simply stared. One whispered, "It feels wrong to leave." Another answered, "Maybe because we learned more about freedom here than anywhere else." The thought hung between them like dust in sunlight. Letters they'd written but never sent lay folded in pockets. Words they couldn't yet confess. Admiration, confusion, guilt. How could they explain to their families that their captors had given them back their dignity? At a small station stop, townspeople gathered to watch the train pass. Children waved American flags. Farmers lifted their hats. The Germans waved back, unsure if it was farewell or forgiveness that filled the air. In one corner of the car, a prisoner unfolded a scrap of paper, a cowboy's sketch of the prairie horizon. Beneath it, scrawled in pencil, were 3 words, "Keep looking forward." He smiled through tears. The journey stretched for days. The plains gave way to forests, the forests to cities, the cities to harbors. As the train rolled on, the men spoke quietly about what waited across the ocean, ruins, hunger, and ghosts. Yet woven through that dread was a strange gratitude. They had entered America expecting cruelty and left with something gentler, a sense of possibility, a belief that decency could exist even after destruction. At night, the train rocked them into uneasy sleep. Dreams came of campfires, coffee, and harmonicas drifting on warm air. When they woke, the memories clung like smoke, reminders of a freedom they'd glimpsed but couldn't yet name. One morning, as dawn burned over the horizon, the train slowed near a pasture. There, in the distance, a lone cowboy rode across the fields, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. The prisoners fell silent. He didn't wave or turn his head. He just kept riding, steady and sure, until the train carried him out of sight. One man whispered, "That's how I'll remember America. Not its cities, but its silence." When they finally reached the port, the air smelled of salt and departure. Ships waited to carry them back to a home they no longer fully recognized. Some felt relief, others dread, most a hollow mixture of both. Before boarding, a guard offered each man a final handshake. "You'll do fine," one said. "Start fresh." The Germans nodded, each gripping that moment like an anchor, the warmth of a human touch after so much loss. As the ship pulled away, the men gathered at the rail, watching America fade into mist. The land of cowboys and coffee, of quiet lessons and unexpected mercy, disappeared beneath the horizon, but it would never leave them. When night fell, one prisoner murmured to the dark sea, "We came here defeated, but we leave changed." His friend answered softly, "Then maybe that's victory after all." The waves carried their words into the wind. Years passed, yet the memories of Texas never faded. The former prisoners returned to a Germany scarred by rubble and silence, but somewhere deep inside they still carried the rhythm of the prairie wind. They came home thinner, quieter, and somehow older. Families welcomed them with tears, but behind the embraces lay questions. How had the enemy treated them? What had they seen across that ocean of defeat? Most could not explain. How could they describe the paradox? That captivity had shown them dignity, that their conquerors had treated them with fairness, that they had found fragments of freedom inside barbed wire. Some tried. They spoke of cowboys who worked harder than soldiers, of guards who taught without shouting, of nights filled with music drifting across the Texas plains. Many listeners simply shook their heads in disbelief. One man's wife wept when he described the endless stew and coffee. "We starved," she whispered. "And you feasted?" The guilt crushed him. Even kindness could leave scars when compared to suffering. But others found hope in those stories. They began to speak differently, softer, less certain of old hatreds. The war had burned away arrogance, leaving space for reflection, for questions, for fragile empathy. Across the ruins, seeds of something new began to grow. Germany rebuilt slowly, painfully. Yet among those who had been prisoners, there was a quiet resolve, a desire to live differently than before. Some became teachers, others farmers. A few formed small clubs dedicated to Western culture, wearing broad hats and strumming guitars. To outsiders it seemed absurd, but to them it was remembrance, a tribute to their unexpected teachers. In smoky taverns and quiet towns, the songs of cowboys found strange new life sung in German accents. The lyrics spoke of dust, distance, and independence, things they had once tasted in another man's land. Historians later called it cultural fascination. The men themselves called it something simpler: gratitude. The cowboy had shown them that strength could be silent, that freedom could exist without conquest, that kindness could rewrite even a soldier's soul. One former officer told a journalist, "They broke us gently, not through power, but through decency. The cowboy taught me more about honor than my generals ever did." His words spread like an unspoken confession. Photographs from the 1950s show ex-prisoners riding horses in West German fields, their faces calm beneath wide-brimmed hats. Neighbors laughed at first, then grew used to the sight. Men learning to breathe again through borrowed traditions. The lessons lingered quietly in their families. Children grew up hearing tales of America not as an enemy, but as a place of vast skies and open hearts. "The land where even guards smiled," one boy recalled years later. For decades, those who had lived through that paradox carried it like contraband in their memories. They rarely spoke of battlefields or defeat. Instead, they spoke of fences that felt like freedom and men who embodied grace. Letters discovered long after the war revealed the depth of their change. I feared the Americans would humiliate us, one wrote. Instead, they reminded me what being human feels like. I will never forget the Cowboys. Time blurred the sharp edges of history, but not the image that remained. A man in a wide hat, leaning on a fence, watching without judgment as the defeated found their footing again. Some returned to Texas decades later, older and grayer, to see the camps turned into wheat fields and quiet museums. Standing under the same vast sky, they whispered thanks to ghosts who had once been their captors. And so the story endured, passed down not in monuments or textbooks, but in memory and myth. Enemies disarmed not by force but by character, soldiers changed not by ideology, but by the simple, enduring code of the cowboy.